I don't know about you, but I have needed the God that shows up in a gale force wind and tries to blow me in the right direction because I don't know which way to go. And maybe you too have needed the God that comes in an earthquake that shakes the earth and shakes the power, that reminds you that God is still in charge and has the power to do something right where you are. And maybe you too, like me, have needed the God that comes in a bonfire because you need the warmth and the light because nothing else could comfort your broken heart. How many times do we long for the God that comes in wind and earthquake and fire? But in today's scripture, with Elijah, it says God was not in those, but he came in the quiet. So what do we do with a God who works in the quiet when it seems we need so much more? As we prepare to reflect on that first, let us pray. Holy God, we come to lay our lives before your holy scripture that we may find the grace that lies waiting there. Let us be a people who know the power of your still small voice. And to all God's people said, amen. So just a recap about Elijah in this moment. Elijah has just experienced one of the greatest victories a prophet of God had ever witnessed. Elijah dared put God to the test, and God complied. Elijah led a showdown between Baal, a god, little g, and the God, big G, of heaven and earth, the God we know, also called Yahweh. And the showdown was asking Baal and the God of heaven and earth to start a fire. So the 400 prophets of Baal laid out their wood and called out to Baal, called out over and over to light the fire. They even cut themselves and bled, pleading for Baal to act. Nothing. Then Elijah, prophet of God of the heavens and the earth, not only did that, but upped the game. Doused the ground and doused the wood with water, and then called upon holy God to light a fire. God ignited it, and it raged hot and light. So people put their face on the ground and turned back towards God, and the way it reads is that prophets of Baal were slain, and rain came to a drought-plagued land. But the queen of the land, Jezebel, was mad. And so she put a bounty on Elijah's head. He's now a target to be killed, and he's stressed, and he's depressed, and he's fearful, and he takes off and flees to the south. And while in the wilderness, God sends his angels to tend to Elijah. And then Elijah sets his sight on the mountain. The mountain where God met Moses and gave the laws of Moses to God's people. So that's the recap for where we find Elijah this morning. And now Elijah's in the mountain. He's hiding in a cave, having run to the place where God showed up because he's being hunted by a queen with power and money and armies. This is a do-or-die moment. It's dire. He's needing the God of might, the God of power. He's needing the God who parts seas and strikes lightning. He's needing the God of wind and fire and earthquake to show up because his servant is in trouble. Haven't you been in that place? Where you, God's servant, is in trouble. Maybe you feel it as you look into the world. Maybe you feel it as you look into the community. Maybe you sense it in your own family or in your own life. Where it's awful and it's dire and you need God to show up. Dear God, do something, do anything. That's where Elijah is this morning. He's hiding in a cave. He needs to meet God, and then he hears this noise. And it's this gale force wind, and he's thinking, finally, God's here. Do you hear the wind? But God is not in the wind. And then he hears the trembling. He feels the shattering, the shaking of the earthquake, and he thinks the God of power is here finally. But God is not in the earthquake. And then he hears the crackling, and the fire starts. He thinks, oh, thank God, the heat and the light and the power of God is here, but God is not in the fire. And then comes the sheer silence. When you need God, when you need answers, when you need hope, when you need help, silence is deafening. It says in Scripture, after the fire came the sheer silence. Translation, the sound of crushed silence. Another translation, the still small voice. The fire was followed by the still small voice of God in the quiet. Elijah the prophet is being hunted by the queen of the land, and God sends the still small voice. I recently had a church member tell me, I don't really hear it when God talks to me the way other people do. I just don't. So I rely on other people to sort that out. It's a good strategy. We need other people on our journey of faith. God designed it that way, but I don't think that person is alone in trying to hear God's voice and see God working and feeling like you don't, because what if God just so often shows up in the crushed silence, in the small voice? What if God's work is so often quiet work? Maybe God works in the quiet because we live in a loud world. The loudest voices seem to get attention and win the day. The most aggressive seem to take the most bounty and make the most gains. The world is filled with a million voices demanding your attention and filled with enough aggression and coercion to make their own gains. But our God comes in the quiet birth under a starry sky in a tiny town with a baby named Jesus, who becomes a man without armies but lives as a suffering servant, who doesn't come with the sword and demand but instead lays down his life and whispers from the cross, "It is finished," and saves us all. Our God shows up with the power of love that is patient and kind, gentle and quiet. He meets us there. Maybe that's why he comes in the quiet so often, or maybe he knows how hard the quiet is for us humans. We'll do anything to drown out the sorrow and the hurt and the fears and the needs. If you ever have insomnia, you know what the quiet is like and what happens in the quiet. Writer Glennon Doyle writes about the time she found out her husband of over 10 years with 3 children was having affairs the entire time they were married. So she finds her way to a yoga class trying to cope with the devastation. And the class, if you've practiced yoga, often begins with intentions for the practice. And so one was, I am practicing with an intention set on world peace. I'm practicing on intention set on love. And finally they get to Glenn and she's, I'm going to just try and survive the class and not break down. So the instructor says, listen, Glennon, your only job is to stay on your mat the whole hour. And so as she begins the practice, she's sitting in the quiet, in the dark for 1 hour, and she has to sit and face what she calls her white-hot loneliness. She's covered in sweat and tears like some kind of baptism, and she stayed on her mat in the quiet. And finally, the instructor comes to her and whispers to her between her sobs, you've stayed on your mat in the quiet the whole time. That is the way of the warrior. I think maybe God meets us in the quiet because he knows that in the quiet we have to and need to face our truth and our realities and our fears and our needs. And because it's so hard for us, because it's so scary, because God's committed to loving us, he meets us in the quiet. Whatever the reason for why God meets us in the quiet, look at Scripture. He meets us in the breath and in the streams and in the dark of night and the quiet hillsides. How many call stories happen in the quiet in our Scripture? That's the discussion of this series. But in today's scripture, in this dire moment, when all heck is breaking loose, God shows up. When Elijah needs God most, God shows up. We may not like how God shows up, but God shows up when Elijah needs him most. He does it with Elijah, and he does it with you. When we need an appearance from God, when we need a word from the Lord, God shows up. He keeps showing up. We may not like that it didn't come in the miraculous or the awesome or the glitzy or the spectacular. Rather, God shows up over and over again in quiet ways and in ordinary ways. So what if we begin to count on that truth? That when we need God most, God shows up. What if we begin to trust that when we need God most, God is going to show up? Because that's the God who has been, that is the God who is now, that is the God who will forever be, and that is the God who loves you. So what if we trust that God is going to show up when God needs us, and he's going to do it so often in quiet ways? I mean, think about, for those of you strange people who love snow, think a moment about the quiet hush after a snowfall. Think about the quiet hush as the sun goes down. Think about the quiet hush right as the sun begins to rise. You know why we love it? We love the hush in those moments because we know it's holy. We know that God is in that. That's what it's like. So if we trust that when we need God most, God's going to start showing up. He's going to rush to our side. He's going to start show up in quiet ways. How do we respond? The scripture today says Elijah listened to the quiet. I say it again. Elijah listened to the quiet. Then he went out of the cave to meet with God, who spoke in a new way. He looked, he listened, he paid attention, and he expected God to meet him, and the quiet called him to it. So when you need God, you listen to the quiet. You move towards the quiet, and you look and listen, you pay attention, you expect for God to speak in new ways. It's like that story from long ago. Long ago, a young boy had a pocket watch, special pocket watch. In his pocket, he worked in a huge barn, huge operation, dry ice held in lots of hay, just massive. Hay everywhere, people everywhere, and the watch slipped from his pocket. He was so distraught that everybody told him, "You'll never find it." Next day, he had the pocket watch. His coworkers asked, he said, I waited till everybody left, and it got quiet. And then I listened. I walked and I listened. And I heard the faint ticking and I followed it, and there I found what I was looking for. And so it is with you and your God. You do not have to wonder if God is going to show up. You don't have to beg and try to convince God to show up for you when you need him, because God loves you. You are his. You are his chosen. You are his beloved. You are his empowered. You are his forgiven. So he comes. Know he is there. Often in the quiet, move toward it. Listen, look, pay attention, and expect God to speak. And you will find what you are most looking for. The God who shows up. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.